Hello team, welcome to my session on Coffee with Prabh, and today we're going to discuss about CRISC Domain 3 risk response and reporting. I already made the videos on CRISC Domain 1 and Domain 2, and based on the feedback only I come up with the Domain 3. Domain 3 is very important for the CRISC exam because 32% of the content is testable in CRISC from this domain only. 32%. Approx 48 question you can expect from the Domain 3. If you're new to my channel, to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to make sure you should not miss my future videos on the similar topic. My name is Prabh Nair, and for more information you can refer my LinkedIn profile. So without wasting a time, let's start with the first part. So when you're talking about Domain 3 is basically split into three parts. Part A, which is called as a risk response, which is a very important for your exam, in which we're going to discuss about risk and control ownership, risk treatment, third-party risk management, issues finding and exception management, management of emerging risk. Then we have a part B in which we're going to discuss about the control design and implementation, because once you identify the risk, you need to address the risk with the help of controls. So control types, standards framework, control design, selection, analysis, control implementation, control testing and effectiveness evaluation. So that is basically part of the part B. Then we have a part C, which is called as a risk treatment plan, data collection, risk control monitoring techniques, reporting techniques, KPI, KRI, which is very important for your CRISC exam. So let's start with the part A first, in which we're going to discuss about risk response. Okay. So the first part of the risk response is risk and control ownership. So team, when you're talking about in domain 1 and domain 2, we are in a stage of the risk which is identified. Now once the risk is identified, what is the next step? So every risk identified in the risk register should have a specified owner at the management level. Same like, when we conducting any audit, we identify any risk in any process, we basically submit the audit report. In the audit report, we talk about the risk associated with the process and our suggestions. Okay, our recommendations. So there should be someone took the ownership of that particular risk, and there should be someone who should take a ownership of the action plan on the recommendation, which is basically shared by me. Example, like during an audit, I discovered that there is an absence of the change management process, which is basically lead to the operational risk. So there is one guy named is Rajiv. He is accountable for introducing a change management process. So I give him a recommendation that, you must have a change management process. So there will be a owner who will be taking an accountability of implementing a control to address the risk. That is why whatever the risk is identified, it need to be updated in the risk register. And along with that, we also need to update the owner detail who is responsible or accountable for implementing a control for that. One more important thing, as an owner, they should be empowered to make the decisions on the behalf of the enterprise. And in general, the risk owner should be a senior executive or manager responsible for one or more of the business process or function that may be impacted. So as a risk practitioner, they should communicate with the risk owner to ensure they are aware of what risk response have already been implemented and the responses that are pending implementation. So that is a one thing. So that is basically the part 1, which is called as every risk is identified. Second is when you're dealing with the risk controls and ownership, sometime we have discovered the risk in one particular process and we have ignored the risk in the other process. There is a possibility. So sometime what happen, when we don't give attention to this risk, later on this risk is basically lead to the other risk, and then it become a high risk for us. So it is very important. Do not consider only one aspect of the risk. Example, like we have discovered weak password in the data center. Okay, that weak password as a vulnerability we have identified in the data center, but we have discovered the weak password in one of the server, which is not very critical. So we have document as a medium risk. Okay, we have identified one of the server which is configured with the weak password, but that server does not hold any value. But there is a possibility that hacker can able to hack into that server, and from there he can do the further attack on the critical servers. So it is very important. We need to check how one risk is basically impact the overall organization, and that concept is called as an aggregate risk. So aggregate risk is evaluated against the strategic risk appetite and deal with the organization wide impact. If I just ignore the risk only from the one asset point of view, that okay, this asset does not have a value, it can backfire in the later stage. Okay, so that is why we need to see how this particular risk impact the tactical, operational and strategic. So where aggregation is incomplete or ineffective, the senior executives may lack the information they need to make a good business decision to manage the challenging circumstances. So at its worst, the implication of the poor aggregation can reach the level where the organization continued existence may be in jeopardy situation. So it is very important, aggregate the things, evaluate and then map with the risk appetite. Okay, so that's a very important thing when you're dealing with the risk control ownership. See, this domain, when you talk about domain 3, is all about how you're responding to the risk that you have identified during a qualitative and quantitative analysis. So this domain is only and only dealing with the risk results. Okay, so once the risk is identified, you need to respond to the risk. So we have 4 options here, which is basically risk acceptance, mitigation, transfer / sharing, avoidance. But before going to discuss about the risk response option, we need to first understand how we handle the risk. Okay. See, one thing is that whenever we need to respond to any particular risk, so the goal of the risk response is to bring the risk into alignment with the organization risk appetite and tolerance level. Example, like this is my risk capacity, which is a maximum risk that we take. You can check my CRISC introduction and domain 1, in which I have explained in a more detailed manner what is risk capacity and what is basically called as a risk appetite. And this is basically the pointer we called as a risk tolerance. Okay, so this is basically called as a risk tolerance. So whatever the risk response we are introducing, like, we need to accept, avoid and all that, make sure it should be aligned with the risk capacity and risk appetite. Okay, so that is why we said the goal of a risk response is to bring the risk into alignment with the organization risk appetite and tolerance level. So this is the exam question also. That's why I have mentioned this pointer, because any risk which exceed the capacity, we have to avoid the risk. But any risk is basically between that. Our goal is to bring the risk below the appetite level or equal to the appetite level. So make sure align the risk response with the business objective. That is the best risk response you can have. Okay, so we have 4 options here in the risk response. Like, we accept the risk. Definitely we will accept the risk in the case of when the the tolerance is basically equal to appetite or below the appetite. Current risk is basically above the appetite. We are implementing control to bring the risk below the appetite. That is called as a risk mitigation. We go for risk transfer when the likelihood is low, but impact is basically very high. Like medical insurance, cyber insurance. See, we don't take cyber insurance. We don't take any kind of a third party insurance because every day we are facing incident. No, any point of time, if we face any kind of incident, okay, there is a third party who will taking care of the financial impact. Example, like there is a customer. He went to the bank to open an account. Bank is basically decide to store data in the cloud. Now there is an insurance has been signed between bank and cloud. If any security breach happen in the case of cloud, cloud is the one who will pay the penalty to the bank, and then bank will pay the penalty to the customer. See, in this case, in a risk transfer case, we have transferred the impact to third party, but you cannot transfer the accountability. Tomorrow, if any security breach happen in the cloud, it is still bank is the one who answerable to regulatory authority also, and it is responsible to the customer also. Suppose you came for me training, or you came for my some kind of exam preparation. So you have seen the face of Prabh. Okay, but what I did, I transfer your case to another trainer. So even he basically teach you CRISC, and even if you fail, then by end of the day, I am the one who answerable to you. That is a different story. I have a good contract with the trainer that if my client is failed, you have to pay me penalty, and that money I can give it to you. But the respect I earn, the trust I gain based on which you enroll, that cannot be repaired here. So I have transferred the impact to third party, but I cannot transfer the accountability. So that is the one thing you need to remember. In most of the cases, we basically avoid the risk. See, avoid risk is basically mean we avoiding an opportunity that bring risk to the organization. One example I can give you is discontinuation of the high configuration firewall, which increasing more risk for the company. Discontinuation of the end of life product usage in the company, because we know that, okay, if I continue the product, it increase more risk for the organization. Not going for the CRISC exam is also kind of a risk avoidance. So keep in mind, the purpose of defining a risk response is to bring risk with the enterprise defined risk appetite and tolerance as cost effective as possible, not to eliminate or minimize the risk at all costs, because risk elimination is not possible. So all your response activity incur some cost. Okay, typically a mix of direct cost of response and potential cost of impact. So finding the right balance is a management function that consider all the constraints mentioned earlier, such as budget, time, and resource. But one thing always remember, whatever the response you have toward the risk, make sure it should be documented and aligned with the appetite and tolerance level, and make sure it should be aligned with the business objective. So after understanding the risk treatment, which is response, we also have further some slides on risk response. See, as I said, whenever you respond to the risk, the most important factor we are considering here is this one. It is clearly mentioned, the selection of appropriate response is often based mainly on the value obtained for the cost and document in the business case. Example, like you have identified that this risk need to be addressed by this control. It is not something you can implement the control. You will submit the business case in which you're giving a justification of why you are introducing this control. Example, like we have understood there's a lot of virus and cyber security incidents happening in the data center. So I submit the business case, the need of the SIM and incident management team. Always remember one thing, whenever you submit any kind of a need for solution, your why should be clear, because management always asks for the why. And that is submit in the business case. It is not something you randomly implement. Even the risk register, you're giving an action plan, countermeasure details and everything. But when you submit to the management, you need to submit the business case. Okay, so always remember, whenever you selecting a response, make sure it should be mapped with the cost and document in the business case. Second most important thing, you need to document all the risk response in the risk register. So this is the exam question, like after identifying the risk, what is the next step? So documenting a risk in a risk register. Post treatment of the risk also you need to update in a risk register, in which you need to document about the accountability, who is taking the accountability of that particular risk, what is the time frame in which the risk is going to be closed or risk is going to be limit, and on that particular date you have to do follow-up and look for the evidence. So this is how you're going to respond to the risk. Okay, next part is called as a third-party risk management. You can see like that absence of this particular process in the company can bring more trouble for the company. I can give an example. Suppose we have a company A. This is my company. In this company, there is a one department we have which is called as a vendor management team. Vendor management team, okay? Vendor management team. Now this vendor management team, whenever they onboard any company, example like we have a company 1, we have a company 2, we have a company 3. Okay, so this company is basically offer software solution. This company offer cloud solution. This company offer MSSP solution. So before we onboard this vendor, we do the proper assessment, okay, of the vendor. Okay, so example like we will ensure that, okay, these vendors are compliant with our governance. They have a good appropriate policies. They compliance with our legal regulatory requirement. Example like I join as a risk assessor in one of the European based company. They're planning to onboard one vendor who can offer them services. So my first criteria is that whatever the data acquisition they have, whatever the policy they have, they should be comply with my GDPR. And I'm also trying to evaluate the risk associated with their vendors, so that proactively we can address everything in the contract and SLA, because by contract only we can able to establish the relation. So proper proper assessment of the risk of the vendor, proper assessment of the gaps of vendor or any service before we onboard, that is called as a third party risk management. So when enterprise is contracted to provide or deliver service or equipment, the risk of non-compliance with the agreement must be met through a review, monitoring and enforcement of the contract terms. Any failure to meet the contract term must be identified and addressed as quickly as possible, which is part of the third party risk management. So here one more important thing we need to understand: as a client, I am based out in EU and I decided to outsource some of the operation on a cloud to AWS. Even there is a security breach happen in the AWS, client is the one who answerable to their regulatory authority. So you can transfer the risk, but you cannot transfer the accountability. You are still accountable to the GDPR authority or regulatory authority. That is why it is clearly mentioned risk responsibility transferred to third party, but enterprise still accountable for the risk. So you have to be very careful. One more example is like in the case of IaaS services, infrastructure as services, you have a better visibility because you have a control over the machines and everything. But in the case of software as a service, you have a limited visibility. So you're requesting some more customization in the contract when you're dealing with the SaaS, where you're requesting for the audit report, VAPT reports and all that, because that is how you can have a visibility about the infrastructure. So risk of non-compliance with the agreement must be met through a review, monitoring, enforcement of the contract term. Do not assume anything. Make sure you should document everything. Limited mitigation may be attained using a carefully worded indemnify clause, because that is how you can transfer the risk. Now, example, you have purchased some custom application from the vendor. In that case, you don't have access to the source code. So only way you can able to transfer the risk is through the contract only. Okay, because if in the contract, if you said that, okay, any risk, any vulnerability we discover in the application, it is your responsibility. So they have to take the responsibility of that. So that is how you can be able to transfer the risk. And make sure anything you are assuming and documenting in terms of expectation that need to be captured in the SLA, service level agreement. Now, I have seen a lot of folks who always get confused with contract and SLA. See, contract is the fixed document which is signed between the two party 1 and party 2. Okay, party 2. But there will be some variables in the contract. Example, like you have approached me for the CRISC training. So training should be start from 9th July to 15th July. So this is as per the contract, we have to do that, but it does not mean that entire 24 hour I'm going to teach you CRISC. So we have agreed on some time, like 9 a.m. in the morning, we'll start the session, and 5 p.m. in the evening, we will basically conclude the session. If I start a session late by 5 minutes, which is called 9:05 or 9:10, then you have a complete right to penalize me. So this is basically part of the SLA. Okay, so expectation of a service between the customer and vendor. Okay, so that is captured in the SLA. And if I fail to abide with the SLA, then as per the contract, you have a complete right to you can sue me against that particular requirement. That is why contract is a legal document in which SLA defined as a variable. Even in the case of SLA, the first thing we basically customer share is SLR, service level requirement. What is his expectation? Then I will basically agree on the expectation, which is called as an agreement. And then post training, we'll basically compare what is agreed, what is delivered, which is called as a SLR. Okay, so SLA is a formal guarantee that certain performance target or standards will be met and include predetermined compensation for failure to meet those targets. In many cases, the compensation takes the form of monetary offset against the future expenses. So as a risk practitioner, it should be recognized that even generously crafted SLA remedies are form of risk sharing and do not offset the reputational or long-term impact. So once we basically engage the vendor, we proceed for the next thing, which is called as the issues, findings, and exception management. See, anything we introduce in the organization, it's not necessary that it is always a rigid. If I'm introducing a policy is available for customization, policies available for exceptions. Example, like we have a policy that every employee must come to the office by 9 a.m. But one day what happened, because of flood or because of some rain, he coming at 9:30. So there are some exceptions are there, but make sure you should drop an email for that. Later on, we have noticed more than 100 employees are coming 9:30. So we understood, okay, there is a demand for extending a time. So according to that, we update the policy with 9:30. So exceptions is always there. Sometimes what happens when you're dealing with the risk management, it is very important that asset should have a uniformity. And that is where the configuration management is come into the picture, because we need a standardization. Understood? So example, you as a risk practitioner doing a risk assessment of the assets. Now just imagine you have a 10,000 assets in the organization, and each and every asset is running with a different configuration. So if we have a configuration management process in place, which is called as a secure configuration build, then we can able to bring the uniformity about the configuration. So as a risk practitioner, instead of assessing each and every system, he will take a sample of one system, and based on that, he can able to present their opinion. That is why configuration management bring the uniformity, and any kind of a changes in the configuration management need to go through a change management process. That is why whenever auditor, assessor is come for an audit, he always asks for the configuration baseline, one sample as a system or configuration logs. Now next thing is basically called as a release management. So in an environment where the software is developed for internal use, the formal management of release of new updates or version of developed application is very important. So release should be coordinated with the production staff, subject to the independent non-developers verification and protection prior to the deployment, and make sure it should be aligned with the enterprise overall life cycle for the system development. Okay, example, like we have a system A, we have a system B, we have a system B, we have a system D. So we need to introduce some patches for the systems. So with the help of release management, we will introduce those patches in the system. And by this way, we will able to update the configuration things. Okay. Sometime what happen, we have to go through a exceptions management also. As I said, policy procedure exists to standardize the decision and behavior. However, the enterprise may encounter the circumstances where the usual practice are unsuitable due to the timely technical or administrative constraints. So any exception should be formally documented and approved by the senior manager or executive before it acted upon. So every exceptions represent the deviation from the standards and therefore introduce the complexity which can create or obscure the risk. Therefore, exceptions should be reviewed at least annually to ensure they are still necessary, and any unnecessary exceptions should be removed. Okay, so this is where we basically involve the change management and all that. Okay, so these are some of the things need to be introduced to manage our exceptions and everything. Okay, change management also play a very important role because that is a critical part of all the processes, and it ensures the integrity, and also it ensures that only authorized changes should be introduced in the organization. Okay. Now next thing is basically called managing emerging risk. See, we done with the risk response, we introduced the exception process. Now what next? The risk which you identified, the risk you mitigated, it doesn't mean you should ignore that. Okay, we need to monitor those risks, and the reason is very simple, is sometimes that risk is lead to the emerging risk also. So risk is a fundamentally dynamic because it arises from the uncertainty. Remember that. Okay, even the most well-developed risk management program must operate on a continuous basis to be effective, because new area of risk are always emerging. Like we have ignoring the COVID symptoms and not wearing a mask. So that is an emergent risk for me. Continuing the people to work from home, using their personal laptop to connect with the enterprise. That is my emerging risk from the bring your own device. So if we don't monitor that, later on it can backfire us. So deployment of sometime new control, introduction of a new technology, both have a potential to contribute to the emerging risk. So it is very important that whatever the challenge you are facing, whatever the emerging technologies we have and their associate controls which come with a new risk, that need to be documented. So any control changes should be carefully considered. That is why what happened, any kind of a change in the control, any kind of a change in the initiative need to go through a change management process. Okay, and this include both the addition of a new control and modification of existing control. Beyond there is an intended benefit to the enterprise, like new or updated control may also introduce the new vulnerability. For example, any access control system that protect against unauthorized access may be inadvertently deny access to the legitimate user who forget the password or lose access card, resulting in a call for technical assistance and delay in the processing and the user frustration. Okay, second is called as the impact of the emerging technology on the design and implementation of a control. See, emerging technology can have a significant effect on the design and implementation of a control, and sometimes beneficials, other time also there. So organization risk profile are also subject to a sudden and potentially severe changes, which is occurred with the global pandemic of 2020 and shift of large portion of workforce away from a managed workspace to the home office and remote environment. Okay, so wherever there's an alternate channel exists for data movement, organization may find that risk profile have expanded far beyond the expectation. So make sure you should validate effectively. So what is your role as a risk practitioner? What is your role toward this emerging risk and how you respond to that? Make sure whatever the controls we have, it should be designed in such a manner to reduce the impact. And as a risk practitioner, we may find it beneficial to use automated network scanners and other tools to detect all kind of unparameters or unexpected parameters, which is completely against the deviations. So proactively we can able to respond to those activities. Okay. And if it's basically some unauthorized are implemented, we need to go through exception management and get an approval for that and implement in the system. So that is the role of a risk practitioner we have. Let's move to the part B. So part B is called as a control design and implementation. So now it's time to implement the controls, because controls are a best way to manage the risk. Controls are basically the best way to mitigate the risk. So whenever we basically talking about the control, the selection of a controls, we sometimes refer standard, we refer framework, we refer some kind of a best practice from where we basically implement the controls. Example like ISO 27001. They have a list of controls by which we can able to achieve the information security in the organization. We can refer NIST also, NIST standard, which also have some list of controls that we can basically adopt to mitigate the risk in the organization. So it is good to adopt a standards and framework best practice by which we can able to mitigate the risk. Along with that, we have organized the controls into 3 categories. So we have an administrative control, we have a technical control, and we have a physical control. There is one dedicated video I made on the control type and category, but here I can just give you a very high level overview about administrative control, technical and physical. Administrative control is a control which is used for administrative in nature. Example like senior management has announced in the company that if anyone wish to resume back, they must carry a vaccination certificate. So this is something like a policy. This is something like an order which is introduced in the company. So it is an administrative control. Okay. Second is called as a technical control, the control that we implement technical in nature. Okay, example like there is a firewall. In the firewall we have created a rule like source is any, destination is a web server, source port is any, destination port is 80. So any traffic is going to the firewall. So firewall is a technical in nature. Their technical function will basically block the packet. So it is not me who going to block that. There is a technical function of firewall will going to block that. Then third is called as a physical control, the control which is implemented in a physical in nature. Example like placement of a security guard outside of the facility which try to stop us physically. So that is another example of a physical control. Or there is a lock, there is a gate which basically prevent unauthorized user to access the facility physically. So these are called as a administrative, technical and physical control. Now once you implement the control, you need to do the proper assessment of the control also. Because just implementing a control, okay, and we just trusting that, okay, it will achieve the predefined objective does not make sense. So it is very important on a regular basis do the proper assessment to make sure it should have a proper maturity and by which we can able to resilient against all kind of a risk. So on a regular basis, we basically assess the maturity of a control to check how effective is the control in the organization. And we basically measure from level 0 to level 5. Then we also go for the control design selection analysis and selection criteria by which we can basically implement the control. One thing always remember, whatever the control you are selecting, whatever the control you are implementing, you need to document that, because by this way we can have a better visibility about the control functions. Let's move to the next part. So question is how to implement the control. That's always a question among the participants. Like, what is the best way to implement the control? So we have a different type of control. The first is called as a parallel changeover. Okay. So one question will be there in the exam on the different phases of control implementation. Okay. How to implement the control. So first is called as a parallel changeover. So parallel changeover, it means that we are operating both the new system and the old system simultaneously. Example, my current firewall was ineffective to manage the risk. So parallelly what I did, I built another firewall. So parallel processing allow the project team greater latitude to test the reliability and performance of the new system and ensure that it is working correctly before removing the old system from services, because it is also minimize the risk of a failed changeover to the new system and allow the staff to train on become familiar with the new system before it is in a full production. Example, right now both firewall is working in the active state. So tomorrow, if slowly and gradually I can remove this firewall, and then this firewall will work more effectively in the organization, but both are running on the same time. So this is called as a parallel changeover. We adopt parallel changeover in that case when the applications or service are very critical. Second is called as a phase changeover. So phased changeover is conducted by replacing the individual component or module of the old system with the new or modified component. Like component 1 will be replaced with component 2 as a new component. So this basically reduces the risk by gradually rolling out a new module in a way that intended to avoid impacting the entire system. And we go for the phase changeover in that case when the technology is complex, when architecture is complex. Remember that, okay? Third is basically called as an abrupt changeover. Now, abrupt changeover means that there is a single instant movement from the old system to the new system, with the old system immediately take offline. So abrupt changeover is the riskiest of the changeover process because of the potential for loss opportunity in business processing if it becomes necessary to revert to the earlier system. And for this reason, abrupt changeover is most prevalent in a case in which rollback is relatively assured or impact of the loss processing is minor. Example, like right now, we are running this particular as a primary system and we basically introduce a secondary system. It basically face some kind of an issue, so immediately we up this particular thing. But during that time, if there is a downtime is there and any kind of a cost of downtime we have already agreed, then it is okay, because during a downtime there is a possibility some data loss will be there. And last is basically called as a fallback. Fallback is basically we can able to go to the previous state, so that is called as a fallback. When you implementing this particular change over techniques, we also do the lesson learning, which is part of the post implementation review. So post implementation review offer the best opportunity to capture the lesson which is learned so that it can apply to the future projects. Not all lesson may be evident right away, but assess the changes over the time, assess the effectiveness and value. So whatever the changeovers we have, we should learn from there and make sure they should not be repeat again. So summary is that parallel changeover, it means we have a two system in place. Slowly and gradually we replace one system to other. Phase changeover is basically changes in the phases, which is basically applicable in the case of complex environment. Third is called as an abrupt changeover. Suddenly it was shut down and then we have rollback to the new changeover, but there is some downtime that we have to agreed. And whatever the learning we have from the changeovers and all that is part of the post implementation review. Now, whenever we basically implementing any controls, we go for some good testing. Like example, like we building a control itself. Okay, like small modules we are building. So during that time, we can do the unit testing and code review of the control. We also check the quality assurance to make sure whatever the controls has a necessary feature, it is aligned with the business objectives. See, why they're talking about unit testing is, suppose you are the your application development team is building some patches. They're building some kind of a application to address some gap. So the first level of testing we can do on the application is a unit level, where we're building a small modules which is tested by the developers. Then they introduce the interface to integrate those modules. That is called as a interface testing. And when the overall system is basically built on that, we're doing a testing that is a quality assurance testing, that is called as a user acceptance testing. So effective testing consider specific consideration for data, version control and code to extend that these apply to a given control. And after that, you need to update the risk register. See, risk register we first update when we identify the risk, and risk register again we implement after implementing a control. So risk register should show the progress of testing and attainment of the milestone during the progress of each mitigation project. By keeping the risk register accurate and up to date, the risk practitioner or risk manager ensure that it is consistently available as a resource for a risk management activity across the organization. So make sure you will use the risk register parallelly in entire phases. So next is basically called as a risk monitoring and reporting. Very important section of the domain 3, because once you implement the control, after that the risk which is left, that is called as a residual risk. So it is very important to monitor the residual risk, and until unless you don't have any kind of a KPI and KRI to measure the risk, you can enable to build the solid effective controls. So that is why you need to introduce strong metrics by which you can able to measure the effectiveness of the information security of an organization. So in this section, we're going to discuss about that only. Okay, so as we're talking about the last stage of which is called as a monitoring, in this section, the first part we're going to discuss about is data collection, aggregation, analysis, and validation. Okay. So risk practitioner or risk manager has a wealth of data source available, including the network device, application logs, threat intelligence, and audit report. An operations staff frequently aggregate the data from a multiple source for the broader visibility. Keep in mind that aggregated data typically present a summary view that may obscure the details present in the individual sources. So risk practitioners searching for the unusual activity should keep in mind that detailed analysis of the original source may reveal pattern not identifiable under the aggregation. So that is why more and more data we collect, more and more visibility we get. And that is why we have a different kind of a solutions also. Like one of the solution that we use is SIEM. The reason of introducing SIEM is that first we have a log management system. Example, like we have a firewall here, and it is connected with the switch. We have a system A, we have a system B, we have a system C, we have a system D. So this is basically where we introduce the log server. Syslog we also called. Log server, it is also called as a syslog. So now what happened, let's take an example. So there is a IP 1.1.1.1 able to bypass the firewall and able to attack system A, system B, system C, system C. So manually what happened is I need to go to each and every system to collect and review the logs, which is basically a very problematic activity for me. So what I did here is whatever activity happening on all the systems, okay, all these are basically logs are stored in the centralized log server. So now from the log server, I can able to have a better visibility how this 1.1 able to bypass the firewall and attack 4 systems. But problem is that still I need to manually analyze the log, manually review the log, manually I need to aggregate the log, how this 1.1 attack the firewall and all that. So to overcome that, nowadays we use a SIEM. So now we have a firewall here. It is basically connected with the switch. We have a system A, we have a system B, we have a system C, and this is basically the SIEM we have now. Now this SIEM is basically have a both function, log management plus event management. So now what happened is there is a attacker 1.1.1.1 able to bypass the firewall, able to attack system A, B, C. So this logs goes to SIM, this log goes to SIM, this log goes to the SIM, and these logs are goes to the SIM. So first thing what SIM does is they aggregate the log from all the system. Second is they do the normalization. Normalization mean firewall generating a log in their format. Example, they generate like that. 1410 IST IP is 1.1.1.1, where in this system generating a log in their format IST 14.1.0 1.1.1.1. So this is the different format, this is the different format. So once you does the normalization, you can convert into the common event. So SIM basically collect, aggregate and normalize in a common parameter. So it is easy for the security administrator to review, and then it is easy for him to respond to the alert. So in the log management, it is just a reactive control. It stores the logs, but SIM store the logs and respond to the logs and try to respond to the event as early as possible. That is why it is a very effective tool for the monitoring. Sometimes we also go for the ITF, integrated test facility. So when seeking to monitor the performance and operation of an application, one common method is to use the integrated test facility. So ITF is a testing methodology that processes test data through a production system to test whether systems are operating correctly. Sometimes what happens when we build application, we perform some realistic testing on that to check whether it is prone for any kind of a error. Is the transaction can be done successfully. So in that case, we perform the ITF. So any question talking about test data through a production system, performing a simulated transaction from the production system to check the controls, that is called as a ITF. Sometimes we use the external source of information also, like threat intelligence, threat feeds and all that, by which we try to understand the cybersecurity posture of an organization. So these are the different kind of a data we collect by which we try to improve our existing controls. Sometimes we also do some other activity. Okay. And purpose of control monitoring here is to verify whether control is effectively addressing the risk and not the test whether control itself is working. Because after identifying risk, we have implemented the firewall, we have implemented the password controls, but the question is that whether it is working effectively or not. So that is why we have a different way to assess the control effectiveness. So we have a self-assessment. Here you can see we have a self-assessment, we have a IS audit, we have a vulnerability assessment, we have a penetration testing, and we have a third-party assurance. So if you're taking an example of a self-assessment is basically a more like a survey workshops and all that. Okay. So we have a facilitated workshops, survey or sampling method where the operations staff can determine the general effectiveness of a control on a regular basis or recurring basis. So in time, these self-assessments establish the baseline which can be used to highlight the deviations that may indicate the control weakness or failure. Okay, so COSO framework COBIT is basically always promote this particular thing. Then second is called as a IS audit. Audit is basically used to audit the control effectiveness. Normally you face about internal audit, external audit and all that. Sometimes we have to do the assessment which is technical in nature, and that is where the vulnerability assessment and penetration testing come into the picture. The thin line difference between the vulnerability assessment and penetration testing is that vulnerability assessment is only talk about identification of the vulnerability. So this is the system we have. We just identifying whether we have a weak password or we have any services. But penetration testing is not only identifying the weak password, but they try to exploit and getting into the system. So yes, the more aggressive is the PT. One thing remember that if we have an agreement of conducting a VA and you're doing a PT, it is against the company principles. So if you have an approval of PT, then only you can do the PT. And the purpose of VA and PT is to deliver the information to management that is the control is working effectively as per the defined objectives. So summary is that vulnerability assessment is all about identification of the weakness in the system, whereas the penetration testing is all about exploiting a weakness and getting into the system. Sometimes we also go for the third party assurance. Example, like we involve the third party auditors to conduct an audit of my organization. Let's take an example. I have an auditor in my organization who does the audit for our processes, but sometime under the peer pressure, he will not able to provide the independent reports. So in that case, we involve the external auditor who is not part of the company. He conduct the audit and he provide me the independent assurance about what is happening. So example like 27001 audit, PCI DSS audits, COBIT audits, and that basically bring more confidence among the stakeholders. Next is basically called as a reporting. So definitely after doing a risk assessment, we need to prepare the report. So we have a 3 type of reports: heat map, scorecard, and dashboard. So when you're talking about heat map, heat map is used to create a graphical representation of the risk, okay, which is basically distributed across the particular scope, which might be a department, system, or enterprise. That is called as a heat map. Second is called as a scorecard, similar to the academia grad report. Okay, risk scorecard seek to simplify the risk reporting by aggregating the performance across the selected functional area and then assign the score to that. We're giving a score like high, low, and medium. So scoring is typically done in a manner that reflect the alignment with the enterprise risk appetite, so the base as is possible. Third is basically called as a dashboard. In practice, the effect of dashboard tend to be elimination of the focus from anything that is fault to draw the sufficient attention. That is why we have a very good informative dashboard which is present to the management. Because when data are presented sequentially with a distinct indicator for each item, the presentation is commonly called as a dashboard. So value assigned to each dashboard item may be numeric score, color coded, spotlight indicators, and sometimes combination of a two. And the intent is to allow the rapid focus on those items that are falling outside of acceptable level. So from a senior management point of view, dashboard is a very informative. Okay. But the question is this reporting, whatever is happening, how they basically generate a very good report. So this is basically done through a matrix. Okay, so we have a 3 type of matrix here: key performance indicator, key risk indicator, and key control indicator. Very, very important for the exam. So to understand this matrix, I would like to take one real analogy. Example, there is a car. So there is a car. So in a car, there is a tank. Tank is basically have a fuel. So when tank is empty, the process will be failed because car will not able to run. So car become inoperable, right? So this is a KPI, key performance indicator. So how much fuel we have, according to that, it drive the car. So when the tank is nearly empty, the key risk indicator alert the driver to a risk condition. If not addressed, it may lead to a violation of a KPI. I repeat again, when the tank is nearly empty. So this is the tank we have, and if it basically go till the maximum. Okay, so we set the reserve, right? In the car, we set the reserve. So the reserve is basically called as a risk indicator alert. And after reaching the risk indicator, if you don't give attention to that, then car performance will be degraded. And that is lead to the violation of a KPI. Okay, so that is how we basically set the indicator. So risk indicator are used to measure the risk level in comparison to define the risk threshold. So the organization receive an alert when the risk level approach as unacceptable. Okay, so that is a pointer we have. So one example of the key risk indicator is like a quantity of unauthorized equipments or software detected in a scan. So that is basically the KRI. Number of instances of service level agreement exceed the threshold. Okay, number of packet dropped by the firewall. So these are basically the example of the KRI we have. So KRI should be selected carefully and sparingly. In the same example of a car, okay, performance of the car is depending upon the petrol, the fuel in the tank. Okay, so when the tank is empty, the key risk indicator alerts the driver to the risk condition that if not addressed, it may lead to the violation of KPI, because after that car will not work. So that is my KPI. So first we basically set the KRI and that lead to the KPI. Okay, so KRI should be selected carefully and sparingly. We also need to check when you're setting a KRI is that it is linked to any specific risk. Is it incomplete? Is difficult to measure? So these things need to be defined. Okay. So KPI and KRI are always used in a conjunction with one another to measure and monitor the performance and mitigate the risk. Using both KRI and KPI when getting started with the risk management measure, it may be necessary until there is enough data to improve the process. Okay, so always remember the KPI helps to identify underperforming aspect of the enterprise and business function that may require the additional resources and attention. And KRI should provide the early warning of increased risk, which are forward looking to signal the risk to the enterprise. Same like when you're reaching the maximum fuel tank or limited fuel is left. So that is basically the KRI has been sent, and that is mapped with the KPI. Okay, we also have one more important thing which is called as a key control indicator, KCI. So certain indicator reveal the effectiveness of the control. Okay, so KCI allow the management to proactively address the control failure, and the goal of KCI is to track the performance of the control actions which is relative to the tolerance and provide insight into the ongoing advocacy of the given control, which is keeping the risk within an acceptable level. And for this reason, they are sometimes called as a control effectiveness indicator. So I have a summary which give you better visibility. So here we have a KPI, okay, which is car become inoperable, example. And here we have a reserve that we have set, which is called as a key risk indicator. Okay, we have a sensor which checking the fuel tank. Okay, the sensors are very effective. That's why it give alert that we are in the fuel is basically minimum, and that is basically, if I don't give attention to that, it directly impact the performance of the car. So this is how we basically set the things. Okay, one more example is 25 patches need to be deployed every day. So that is basically the key risk indicator. If you fail to achieve that 25 patches, then what is the impact on the performance of the patch management? High, low and medium. So that is how we set the KPI. So we as a business take a decision based on the KPI, key performance indicators. I'm sure this is basically you get a visibility about the domain 3. And if you find this domain 3 useful, do share in your network and do share your comments about some samples of the KRI. And what you best think like about the domain 3, do share in a comment box. And if you're new to my channel, do subscribe to my channel and click on the bell icon to make sure you should not miss my future videos. I'm sorry for my throat. I have recovered from a COVID, but still I'm making these videos. Thank you. Bye.